It was a brutal murder that left investigators baffled. A young mother was shot dead in front of her children. At first, the police had no leads, but an unexpected tip from the victim's family pointed them in a shocking direction. What seemed like a random act of violence soon unraveled into a tangled web of drug trafficking, money laundering, and cold-blooded murder. Now, the authorities had to put the pieces together and track down those responsible. Two little boys were the only witnesses to the crime that took their mother's life. The killing appeared senseless, completely random. But was it? I am Jim Carlston, former head of the FBI field office in New York. The victim, the wife of a prominent Atlanta attorney, carried a dangerous secret. Investigators believe that uncovering this secret would not only explain her murder, but also lead them straight to the killer. On November 29, 1992, in Atlanta, Georgia, like many others after Thanksgiving weekend, a woman was returning home with her children. "I can't wait to get back home, can you?" said 39-year-old Sarah Tokar. She had spent the long holiday weekend in Florida with her family, while her husband, a well-known lawyer and judge, was away on a business trip. After 9 hours on the road, she and her two sons finally arrived at their house in Marietta, a suburban neighborhood of Atlanta. As they pulled into the driveway, the house was dark, but it was not empty. "Are you excited to be home?" she asked her boys. What Sarah didn't see was a man waiting behind the garage. He was armed. Before she could react, the stranger forced Sarah back into the car. Terrified, she obeyed. She had no choice. Her two young sons, 6 and 4 years old, were in the car with her. With a gun pressed to her head, she was ordered to drive toward the city. "Turn left here," the man commanded. Sarah followed his directions, steering the car onto an abandoned lot. "Turn right here." "No, I don't want to go in there," she pleaded, without hesitation. The man pulled the trigger, shooting her in the head at point-blank range. As the car continued rolling forward, the killer grabbed Sarah's handbag and fled. Inside the vehicle, the boys sat in stunned silence, their mother lifeless in the front seat. The older son, just 6 years old, had to reach over her body to turn off the ignition. Then, he unbuckled his sleepy younger brother and, grasping his hand tightly, ran toward the nearest house. The residents immediately called 911. Police responded to reports of a possible homicide in the Powers Road area. Officers from Cobb County arrived swiftly, scouring the scene for the shooter. Homicide detectives gathered at the crime scene, trying to piece together what had happened. The two boys, traumatized but brave, identified the victim as their mother. Their father, still out of town, had no idea what had just happened. Forensics examined the car for clues. Inside and out, a single gunshot had been fired. The splatter pattern and wounds suggested that the shooter had used a shotgun, likely from the back seat. The investigators knew that questioning such young witnesses would be difficult, especially after such a traumatic event. The 6-year-old boy did his best to describe the attacker, an African-American man wearing jeans, a sweatshirt, and a beanie. Beyond that, he struggled to recall details. He didn't know which direction the killer had fled. The only thing he remembered clearly was a weapon. It looked like a pirate gun, just like the ones he had seen on television. "We'll call your dad," the officers reassured the boys. Meanwhile, detectives hoped that the autopsy would reveal more clues. Until their father arrived, the children were placed in the care of relatives who lived nearby. At the same time, police traced the license plate of Sarah's car to confirm the family's address. Investigators then headed to the Tokar residence, the place where the nightmare had begun. Inside the home, crime scene technicians took photographs, searching for signs of forced entry. Near the sliding glass door in the living room, they found a security bar lying on the floor. The alarm system wasn't triggered, one officer noted. "Take some close-up shots," another instructed. Had Sarah walked in on a burglar when she returned home? Strangely, there were no obvious signs of theft, no missing valuables, no evidence left behind. Arthur Hall, the lead detective from Cobb County at the time, later reflected on the investigation. "We had no idea what we were dealing with. This was a quiet, upper-class neighborhood. A mother being murdered in front of her children? It was unheard of. The worst crime we ever saw here was vandalism. We were completely baffled as to why something like this had happened." The next step was to create a composite sketch based on the older boy's description. A sketch of a slim African-American man wearing a knit cap was released to the public, but the child's young age made the details unreliable. Meanwhile, the victim's husband, Fred Tokar, was located at his hotel in Montgomery, Alabama. The moment he received the news, he rushed back to Atlanta. As a lawyer himself, Tokar knew he would be considered a suspect. When he met with authorities, he was accompanied by his own attorney. The police had no choice but to question him. "I understand," Tokar said. "I just want to help in any way I can. But I also want to know everything about the case." His alibi was quickly confirmed. At the time of the murder, he had been in Alabama, visiting a client in Montgomery's prison. With Tokar ruled out, detectives had to start looking elsewhere. Fred Tokar, now a grieving husband, assured investigators that he and Sarah had been happily married. He insisted he was willing to answer all their questions and do whatever it took to find her killer. Detectives followed him through his home as he explained the layout and security measures. "As far as I know, all the doors were locked when I left for Montgomery," he stated. The alarm system, however, had been deliberately left off. Why was the alarm disabled? An officer asked. A maintenance worker was supposed to come by over the weekend to repair the water heater. Tokar explained. He then led them down to the basement, where he had his home office. "Take your time, look around," he offered, stepping aside. One item caught the detective's attention: Tokar's personal safe. "Anything valuable inside?" "Usually, I keep around $1,500 in cash," Tokar admitted. But the safe was open and empty. Could Sarah have taken the money for the trip to Florida? One detective asked. Maybe the burglar found the combination. Tokar speculated. He mentioned that the safe's code was written down and hidden in a secure place, one that only he and Sarah knew about. But was that true? With no other evidence found in the house, investigators turned their attention to Sarah's murder. The crime had left the community in shock. The idea that a mother could be executed in front of her children was beyond comprehension. The pressure on authorities to solve the case was mounting. The medical examiner's report soon confirmed the murder weapon, a .410 gauge shotgun. With its sawed-off barrel, it closely resembled the pirate gun Sarah's son had described. Inside Sarah's car, investigators found evidence of the blast, but no shell casings, indicating that the weapon had to be manually reloaded. However, the killer had left behind no DNA, fingerprints, or other forensic traces. "We're dealing with someone who knew what they were doing," one officer concluded. Authorities began digging deeper into Fred Tokar's life. Former U.S. Attorney Buddy Parker, who was working in Atlanta at the time, recalled his reaction to the case. "The moment I heard about Sarah Tokar's murder, I knew it was big. This wasn't just any woman. She was the wife of Fred Tokar, a well-known attorney. He used to be a prosecutor in Fulton County. I knew him from a case we were working on involving a drug trafficker. Fred Tokar was no ordinary defense lawyer. His work put him in contact with major drug dealers facing federal charges. The more the investigators looked, the clearer it became this was no random killing. The case was about to take a dramatic turn. The next day, 2 women walked into the Cobb County Police Station, asking to speak with detectives. Sarah's sister and cousin had something important to share. "We have something you need to see," Sarah's sister said, placing a folder on the table. "What is it?" a detective asked. "Documents, bank records. Sarah gave them to me years ago. She told me if anything ever happened to her, I should take them to the police." Inside the folder was a collection of financial statements, evidence of Fred Tokar's overseas bank accounts from several years prior. The detectives exchanged glances. "How long have you known about this?" one of them asked. "For a while." Sarah suspected Fred was involved in something illegal. Her cousin explained. "She told us she wanted a divorce," her sister added. "But Fred always threatened to take full custody of the kids if she left." Sarah had been trapped. If she divorced him, she'd lose her children. She needed something to use against him. That something turned out to be Fred's financial records. Sarah had secretly copied his files, believing they contained proof of his illegal activities. If her suspicions were correct, these records might have been the only leverage she had. The detectives took the documents and immediately contacted the FBI's Atlanta field office. "We might be looking at something much bigger than a domestic dispute," one detective noted. Special Agent Michael Twible of the FBI was assigned to analyze the documents. "We were asked to assist with the investigation after Sarah's sister handed over the records," Twible later recalled. "What we found was interesting. Fred Tokar had multiple accounts and business holdings, not just in the Turks and Caicos Islands, but also in Montserrat and the Bahamas. The records also revealed something even more suspicious. Tokar had used frontmen to establish numerous businesses throughout Atlanta. These men were legally listed as the owners, but in reality, the businesses were controlled by Tokar. This is textbook money laundering." An agent concluded, while Fred Tokar had never been formally charged with money laundering, he was widely regarded as an expert in the field. Even Buddy Parker, the former U.S. attorney, knew Tokar's reputation. He was well connected in Atlanta. He had friends in the legal world, in politics. Hell, he even advised the state of Georgia on money laundering laws. Investigators realized they weren't just dealing with a grieving husband. Fred Tokar was deeply entrenched in financial crime. The real question was, did his illegal activities have anything to do with his wife's murder? As authorities followed the money, they found a disturbing connection. One of Tokar's clients was a man named Anthony Brown, a notorious cocaine dealer in Atlanta. Months earlier, Brown had been forced out of the city by a rival dealer and had returned to Detroit. Not long after, he was gunned down in front of his mother's house. The murder weapon? A handgun purchased from a gun store north of Atlanta. It was possible that Brown's associates had killed Sarah as a warning to Tokar. But there was another possibility, one even more sinister. What if Tokar himself had orchestrated his wife's murder? Investigators began digging into his personal connections, searching for any sign that he had hired someone to kill Sarah. Then they found something. A name appeared in an unexpected place. Eddie Lawrence. Who was he? Tokar had never mentioned him before, but now his name was coming up in connection with fraudulent business dealings. Could he hold the key to the case? The detectives were about to find out. As investigators dug deeper into Fred Tokar's business dealings, one name kept surfacing: Eddie Lawrence. At first glance, Lawrence appeared to be a small-time businessman, but a closer look revealed that he and Tokar had been involved in various business ventures together, including construction firms and mortgage companies. Stranger still, Lawrence was wanted for check fraud. A detective working the case got a tip from his brother, a Fulton County deputy, who remembered seeing Tokar's name in a case file connected to Lawrence. Was this just another shady business partner, or was there more to it? When investigators traced Lawrence's phone records, they discovered something alarming. He had spoken with Tokar multiple times on the day of Sarah's murder. It was time to bring him in. When police questioned Lawrence, he admitted that he had been in business with Tokar for nearly a year. He insisted, however, that the phone calls had been strictly business-related and that he knew nothing about the murder. The detectives weren't buying it. Instead of arresting him immediately, they charged him with check fraud, allowing them to keep a close eye on him while they worked the case from another angle. Their patience paid off. A confidential informant came forward with shocking new information. On the streets, there were rumors that Eddie Lawrence had been searching for a hitman before Sarah Tokar was killed. Even more damning, he had allegedly asked one of his employees to help him find someone to do the job. The name that came up? Curtis Rower. Rower was a drug addict with a long criminal history, including multiple armed robbery charges. And most importantly, he needed money. If the informant was telling the truth, investigators now had a direct connection between Lawrence and a hired killer. Detectives moved quickly, tracking down Curtis Rower and obtaining a warrant for his arrest. But there was a problem. Rower was unpredictable. He had a violent history, and the police had no idea how he would react when cornered. On December 22, 1992, 3 weeks after Sarah Tokar's murder, a SWAT team surrounded the house where Rower was hiding. When officers knocked, no one answered. But the police weren't leaving empty-handed. They carefully searched the house, checking every room. Then, a faint noise caught an officer's attention. Someone was hiding under the bed. "Come out slowly," an officer commanded. A pair of shaking hands appeared. It was Curtis Rower. He was unarmed and offered no resistance as officers pulled him out and placed him under arrest. He was formally charged with murder. During questioning, Rower denied his involvement in the crime, but he claimed the shooting wasn't his idea. According to him, Eddie Lawrence had offered him $5,000 to kidnap and kill Sarah Tokar. Rower insisted, however, that he hadn't pulled the trigger. Instead, he claimed that Lawrence panicked and fired a gun himself when Sarah refused to drive into the abandoned lot. "I was just there to scare her," Rower insisted. "I didn't shoot her." But could his story be trusted? There was only one person who could confirm whether there was one gunman or two: Sarah's 6-year-old son. Authorities knew it would be difficult to ask such a young child to relive the most traumatic moment of his life, but they had no choice. The little boy was brought in for a police lineup. Behind a one-way mirror, he was asked to identify the man who killed his mother. One by one, several men were brought into the room, including Rower. "Take your time," an officer gently encouraged. The boy stared at the men in front of him, his face full of confusion. Then, after a long pause, he whispered, "I don't know." His memory, clouded by fear and trauma, had failed him. With no way to definitively prove who pulled the trigger, authorities had to move forward with what they had. Eddie Lawrence was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, but he refused to talk. Meanwhile, Fred Tokar, still in Florida, received the news. The police informed him that 2 men had been arrested for his wife's murder. His reaction was strange. Instead of relief, he seemed shaken. Something wasn't right, and the next move he made stunned everyone. News of the arrest spread quickly. Across the country, headlines detailed the brutal murder, the shocking conspiracy, and the alleged hitman-for-hire plot. Fred Tokar found himself at the center of the storm. His wife had been murdered. 2 men had been arrested. If Tokar was innocent, this should have been a moment of relief. But instead of celebrating justice, Fred Tokar vanished. His in-laws, who had been caring for his sons in Florida, tried to reach him, but he wasn't answering his phone. Worried, Sarah's father rushed to the hotel where Tokar had been staying. When he arrived, he found something chilling. Fred Tokar was unconscious in his bed, an empty bottle of sleeping pills beside him. The hotel manager called for an ambulance. "Golden Beach Hotel, room 2. We have an emergency." Tokar had attempted suicide. On the night before Christmas Eve, he had swallowed a lethal dose of pills, seemingly overwhelmed by the weight of the investigation closing in on him. But fate had other plans. Tokar was found just in time and rushed to a nearby hospital. Against all odds, he survived. After regaining consciousness, he held a press conference outside the hospital. "It's been incredibly difficult for me and my children," he told reporters, his voice heavy with emotion. He claimed his suicide attempt was a result of depression and the relentless media scrutiny. "I just want to be left alone," he said. Tokar also announced that he was moving permanently to Florida with his children, hoping to escape the public eye. The press wanted answers. "Mr. Tokar, what do you think about Eddie Lawrence's arrest?" one journalist asked. "Do you believe he was involved in your wife's murder?" Another pushed. Tokar ignored the questions and walked away. But while he was running from the press, the FBI was closing in on him. They were convinced that Tokar was the true mastermind behind Sarah's murder. And now, they had a way to prove it. Federal agents turned to a powerful legal weapon, the RICO Act. Originally designed to dismantle organized crime, RICO allowed prosecutors to charge individuals for crimes they ordered others to commit. If the FBI could prove that Sarah Tokar was murdered to cover up Fred Tokar's illegal business dealings, they could charge him as a co-conspirator, even if he never pulled the trigger. To make the case airtight, they needed one key witness, Eddie Lawrence. For months, Lawrence had refused to talk. He was sitting in jail, remaining silent, knowing that if he spoke against Tokar, his life could be in danger. But after 7 months behind bars, he finally cracked. From his jail cell, he called federal prosecutors in Atlanta. "I want to make a deal," he said. The FBI wasted no time. Lawrence was secretly transported to a safe house in Georgia, where he met with investigators under heavy security. DEA agent Jeff Dowman, who was part of the team protecting him, recalled the moment. We knew how important Lawrence was to the case. If Tokar really did order the hit, we needed someone who could testify to it. Lawrence was our best shot. In a secured location, Eddie Lawrence finally told the full story, and what he revealed changed everything. Inside a secure location, surrounded by federal agents, Eddie Lawrence finally broke his silence. He revealed what really happened, and it was even more disturbing than investigators had imagined. According to Lawrence, Fred Tokar had been planning his wife's murder for months. It all started when Sarah discovered incriminating financial documents. She had proof that Tokar was laundering money for drug traffickers, and she intended to use it against him in their impending divorce. Tokar couldn't let that happen. If she divorces me, she takes everything, he had told Lawrence. His solution? Kill her before she could expose him. At first, Tokar wanted Sarah to be murdered in his office. When that plan fell through, he considered having her killed at home. Eventually, he decided the safest option was to hire a hitman to stage the murder as a robbery gone wrong. He turned to Lawrence, his longtime business partner, and offered him $25,000 to arrange the hit. He wanted it done in front of the kids, Lawrence admitted. That detail made the FBI agents sick to their stomachs. Tokar believed that if his sons witnessed a murder, they would assume it was a random attack and never suspect him. Lawrence was hesitant at first, but Tokar pressured him, reminding him that he owed Tokar thousands of dollars in business loans. Feeling trapped, Lawrence agreed. He reached out to Curtis Rower, a desperate man with a history of violence, and offered him $5,000 to pull the trigger. The night of the murder, everything went according to plan, until the moment Sarah refused to drive into the abandoned lot. That's when Rower panicked. He didn't want to do it anymore, Lawrence confessed. Furious, Lawrence grabbed a shotgun himself and fired. Sarah Tokar died instantly. As the two men fled, Lawrence grabbed Sarah's purse to make it look like a robbery. Now, sitting across from federal agents, Lawrence was ready to testify against Tokar. With his confession, the FBI finally had the missing piece of the puzzle. It was time to take Fred Tokar down. The FBI and local police had one goal: arrest Fred Tokar before he could run. They knew Tokar hated the media and avoided public attention. So they used that against him. Federal agents posed as reporters and gathered outside his Florida home, pretending to cover the case. The plan worked. Frustrated by the media circus outside his house, Tokar called the police himself, demanding that they clear the reporters away. Minutes later, real officers arrived. When Tokar stepped outside to speak with them, FBI agents rushed in. Fred Tokar, you're under arrest. Caught completely off guard, Tokar was placed in handcuffs on his front lawn. His children watched from the window. He was charged with heavy checkmark, conspiracy to commit murder, heavy checkmark, murder for hire, heavy checkmark, money laundering, heavy checkmark, racketeering under the RICO Act. Tokar pleaded not guilty, but the evidence was overwhelming. After a lengthy federal trial, he was convicted on all counts. In 1997, he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole. His greed and arrogance had cost him everything. Sarah Tokar was gone. His children were left motherless, and he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Meanwhile, Curtis Rower, the gunman, was sentenced to life in prison. Eddie Lawrence, who cooperated with authorities, received 10.5 years for his role in the crime. Justice had finally been served. With Fred Tokar sentenced to life without parole, the case that had shocked Atlanta finally came to an end. For investigators, it had been a long and difficult road. What started as a murder with no apparent motive had turned into a tangled web of money laundering, drug deals, and a carefully orchestrated assassination. The people who had played a role in Sarah Tokar's death faced justice. Fred Tokar, convicted of conspiracy, murder for hire, money laundering, and racketeering, sentenced to 4 life terms with no chance of release. Curtis Rower, the gunman, sentenced to life in prison. Eddie Lawrence, the middleman who arranged the hit. He cooperated with authorities and received a 10.5-year sentence. Despite the convictions, nothing could bring Sarah Tokar back. Her 2 young sons, who had witnessed the murder, had to grow up without their mother. They had also lost their father, not to death, but to his own greed and selfishness. Sarah's family fought to ensure that Tokar had no further influence over his children's lives. They wanted them to have a fresh start, far away from their father's crimes. For the authorities who worked the case, it remained one of the most disturbing investigations of their careers. FBI agent Michael Twible reflected on it years later. "I've worked a lot of tough cases, but this one stood out. A husband willing to have his wife murdered in front of their children. To me, that's pure evil." Former U.S. Attorney Buddy Parker agreed. Fred Tokar had everything, a career, wealth, and a family. But it wasn't enough for him. He thought he could outsmart the law, silence his wife, and walk away clean. Instead, he lost everything. The Tokar case became a landmark example of how RICO laws could be used outside of traditional organized crime. But more than that, it was a tragic reminder of how greed and power can destroy lives. Sarah Tokar had tried to escape her husband's grip. She had uncovered his secrets, planning to free herself and protect her children. But in the end, her knowledge made her a target. Her murder was supposed to keep Fred Tokar safe. Instead, it sealed his fate forever. Today, the story of Sarah Tokar's murder continues to haunt those who remember it. Her sons, now adults, have worked hard to move past the trauma of that night. They were just 6 and 4 years old when they lost their mother. And even though they couldn't identify the shooter, their bravery helped spark an investigation that led to justice. The Tokar case remains one of the most infamous murder-for-hire plots in modern history. A cautionary tale of a man who thought he could manipulate the system, hide his crimes, and eliminate the one person who stood in his way. But in the end, the truth came out, and justice, though delayed, was served.